Introduction. The following analysis does not claim to be the definitive account of Jeffrey Epstein's operation, its ideological foundations, or its ultimate purpose. What it offers instead is something the mainstream narrative has consistently failed to provide: a theoretical framework capable of containing the full scope of what the evidence, taken seriously and followed without prejudice, actually suggests. The conventional portrait of Epstein as a wealthy financier and sexual predator, while accurate as far as it goes, does not go nearly far enough. It accounts for the crimes, but not the architecture. It explains the surface, but leaves the structure beneath it entirely unexamined. This document invites the reader to consider an alternative interpretation, one developed not from speculation alone, but from the convergence of primary source material released by the Department of Justice, the investigative frameworks of researchers Whitney Webb and Jason Giorgione, the analytical tools of esoteric history and comparative religion, and a body of scholarship on ancient civilizations, Nazi occultism, and breakaway civilization theory that mainstream discourse has been too cautious, or too compromised, to take seriously. The reader is not asked to accept every argument presented here as established fact. They are asked only to follow the logic, weigh the correspondence, and consider whether the pattern that emerges, connecting Epstein's documented supremacist ideology, his eugenicist fixations, his architectural choices, his intelligence connections, and his scientific gatekeeping into a single coherent operational picture, is more persuasive than the alternative, that all of it was coincidence, eccentricity, and nothing more. The question this document ultimately poses is not whether Jeffrey Epstein was guilty. That question has already been answered. The question is what he was guilty of doing, for whom, toward what end, and within which tradition, one stretching, researchers argue, from the temples of ancient Canaan to the shores of a private Caribbean island whose strange gold dome structure pointed, for those with eyes to see it, not outward to the sea but inward and downward, towards something considerably older and considerably darker than anything a conventional criminal investigation was ever designed to find. The Epstein-Maxwell synthesis, genetic harvesting, and the breakaway civilization. The released Department of Justice documents provide direct evidence of Epstein's personal ideology. In a 2009 email exchange with cognitive psychologist Roger Schank, Epstein used language distinguishing between Jewish investors and 𝗖𝗆𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗶 that, in the assessment of analysts reviewing the files, reflects an ethnic supremacist worldview. A similar pattern appeared in a 2010 email to publicist Peggy Siegel, in which Epstein used the same derogatory term to dismiss non-Jewish executives. Released financial records show that despite his 2008 conviction for child sexual abuse, Epstein continued donating significantly to Orthodox Jewish institutions, while his victims, overwhelmingly non-Jewish young women and girls from economically vulnerable backgrounds, received no such consideration. In February 2026, a panel of United Nations independent experts reviewing the Department of Justice documents described the abuse as occurring against the backdrop of what they called supremacist beliefs, racism, corruption, and extreme misogyny, noting the systematic commodification and dehumanization of his victims. This documented ideological pattern, researchers argue, does not exist in isolation. Investigative journalist Whitney Webb has extensively documented Epstein's eugenicist and transhumanist fixations, including his interest in whether beauty resides in DNA, and his role as an intelligence asset embedded within networks connecting organized crime, Israeli military intelligence, and American national security structures. Building on Webb's intelligence framework, Iranian-American philosopher Jason Giorgione has argued that these fixations manifested in a far more specific form, a consuming obsession shared by Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell with Nordic individuals of blonde, blue-eyed Northern European descent, which Giorgione contends placed their operation at the intersection of eugenics and occultism in a pattern drawing direct comparisons to the racial purity ideologies of the Nazis. Giorgiani specifically claims that Epstein's Zorro Ranch was intended as a site for a breeding program designed to inseminate very young women and girls with what Epstein considered superior genetics, focusing exclusively on Nordic types while actively excluding non-white women. This obsession reportedly extended to Maxwell's personal life. She uniquely hired male aides from Sweden, whose genetic material, including hair samples, was allegedly harvested. Giorgiani further argues that this racial preference connects to the Nordic aliens archetype, a staple of UFO mythology describing extraterrestrials as tall, blonde humans, suggesting Epstein may have viewed these genetics as a biological link to advanced, non-human origins, viewed through the analytical frameworks developed by Webb and Giorgiani. Epstein's role shifts from that of a financial criminal and sex offender to something considerably more structurally significant, a high-level intelligence asset embedded within what researchers describe as deep state or breakaway civilization-backed projects. The intelligence connections underpinning this argument are not speculative. Webb documents, in One Nation, under blackmail, that Epstein's primary financial network, centered on Leslie Wexner and the Mega Group, operated as a joint 𝗖𝗆𝗲𝗏 operation, a conclusion corroborated by former Israeli military intelligence official Ari Ben-Menashe, who stated that both Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were working with Israeli intelligence as far back as the 1980s. Former Mossad case officer Victor Ostrovsky, author of By Way of Deception, stated directly that Epstein worked for Mossad, an insider assessment carrying particular weight given Ostrovsky's first-hand knowledge of Mossad operations. Epstein's own partner Steven Hoffenberg stated that Epstein repeatedly admitted to Mossad ties. Drop Site News further documented, through House Oversight Committee calendars and leaked emails, that Israeli military intelligence officer Yoni Koren, a senior Mossad-linked operative who had served as bureau chief to former Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister Ehud Barak, stayed at Epstein's Manhattan apartment on at least 3 occasions between 2013 and 2015, with Epstein facilitating wire transfers directly to Koren's bank account. Koren coordinated a private Pentagon tour through Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff of both the CIA and the Department of Defense, placing Epstein at the direct intersection of Israeli and American intelligence at the most senior levels. The MI6 dimension runs through Robert Maxwell. Ghislaine's father was a documented British wartime intelligence officer who simultaneously maintained relationships with MI6, the KGB, and the Mossad, with Pergamon Press functioning as an intelligence front across all 3 agencies. Tucker Carlson, in a widely circulated interview, stated on record that Epstein clearly worked for Mossad and CIA and was in contact with British intelligence, describing him not as an asset of any single government, but as an independent power broker operating above representative government entirely, part of what Carlson called a supergovernment running on blackmail, sex with minors, and what he described as practices resembling witchcraft. Webb argues that Ghislaine Maxwell inherited and continued her father's triple intelligence function, and that Epstein was the operational node through which that network projected power. Under this interpretation, his alleged biological fixations were not expressions of personal deviance, but components of a calculated strategic operation involving the systematic harvesting and engineering of genetic material. Giorgiani specifically argues that Epstein funded the research that led to CRISPR genetic engineering technology and planned to implant genetically engineered fetuses into women at Zorro Ranch, a program Johnny directly compares to the Nazi SS Lebensborn project, a super race breeding program operating under the cover of a modeling agency pipeline. Taken together, the author argues, these frameworks suggest that the collection and engineering of Nordic genetic material served a dual strategic purpose. providing biological currency for classified research into genetic resiliency, and potentially laying the foundation for what Giorgiani's broader breakaway civilization research describes as a long-term plan to consolidate global power through a manufactured UFO disclosure event. A plan he argues is fascistic in structure and eugenic in purpose. Webb's research adds a further structural dimension to this argument. Webb documents that Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine's father and a confirmed intelligence asset, used his publishing empire Pergamon Press as an intelligence front, giving his handlers in MI6, the KGB, and the Mossad extraordinary access to prominent academics, scientists, and government figures, while simultaneously monopolizing the scientific journal market in a way that allowed the network to gatekeep and control the flow of cutting-edge research. Webb further documents that Epstein continued this function through his network of elite scientific conferences, which he argues operated as a flytrap, allowing the same clandestine network to identify, recruit, and where necessary neutralize leading scientific minds. Giorgiani extends this structural argument further, arguing that Ghislaine Maxwell continued the family intelligence legacy through Terramar, which he contends functioned not as a genuine conservation organization, but as a cover for monitoring oceanic anomalies, including unidentified submerged objects, connected to what Giorgiani identifies as the Atlantis submarine referenced in the Maxwell files. Taken together, Webb's intelligence framework and Giorgiani's breakaway civilization analysis suggest that the supremacist ideology visible in Epstein's private correspondence was not incidental to his operation, but central to it, that he was a key operative in a network whose goals extended far beyond blackmail and sexual exploitation toward the long-range consolidation of scientific knowledge, genetic material, and ultimately global power. Giorgiani argues that this consolidation was designed to culminate in a manufactured UFO disclosure event, a plan he describes as fascistic in structure and eugenic in purpose. The Atlantis mythos and the architecture of the cube. This preoccupation with specific lineages was, researchers argue, mirrored by an obsession with the Atlantis mythos. The helipad at Zorro Ranch had been landscaped as a labyrinth garden, a detail Giorgiani argues was shaped according to Plato's description of the ground plan of Atlantis. The structure on Little St. James, widely referred to as the Epstein Temple, has become one of the most analyzed icons in investigative research into Epstein's network. Permit records obtained by NBC News show the building was officially filed as a music pavilion housing a grand piano, but the actual structure bears little resemblance to the submitted plans, a discrepancy that has struck researchers as significant. The building features a blue and white striped facade, a golden dome added between 2013 and 2014 and subsequently destroyed by Hurricane Maria in 2017, and an absence of functional windows and doors, details that have collectively prompted theories ranging from Masonic to overtly occult in nature. A Poseidon statue stood atop the building alongside two large golden bird statues, a detail that has led some researchers to suggest it functioned as a maritime shrine either to Poseidon, the patron deity of Atlantis in classical mythology, or to 𝗏𝗏𝗱𝗏, the Canaanite lord of the sea and storms. The most widely discussed interpretation among researchers is the Masonic Lodge theory, driven by the building's structural resemblance to a chamber of reflection. The building is cubic in form, and esoteric researchers note that the cube occupies a central position in Masonic and Solomonic symbolism. It sits at the heart of the Seal of Solomon, and its geometric unfolding, known as the net of the cube, produces a cross, a form researchers link to the Canaanite Phoenician goddess Astarte. Within this interpretive framework, the building's shape alone is read as a deliberate esoteric statement rather than an architectural accident. The Golden Dome was drawn particular attention from researchers working in the fields of sacred architecture and occult symbolism. In the broad tradition of esoteric analysis, gold is understood as compressed or solidified light, and the dome as a form has historically functioned as a representation of the celestial sphere, a symbolic vocabulary visible from the Temple of Solomon through to Islamic and Byzantine sacred architecture. Researchers in this field argued that the dome, understood as the vault of heaven, or the enlightened crown of the human head, signals what initiatory traditions call the wisdom of the grand architect, marking the structure's crown as spiritually significant. Within the Hermetic and occult tradition specifically, the dome is interpreted as a symbol of the union between the sun, gold, and the sky, what esotericists call the arc. Researchers drawing on Kabbalistic frameworks note that because Freemasonry derives much of its symbolic vocabulary from Judaic iconography, the golden dome maps directly onto 𝗓𝗓, the crown, the uppermost point on the Kabbalistic tree of life, and the primal source from which the infinite light of the Ein Sof begins its descent into manifest form. This parallels the role of the dome in traditional Judaism, where it is understood to reflect the Shekinah, the divine presence that hovered over the Holy of Holies, representing the soul's aspiration toward the heavenly throne. Researchers have further noted that the building's doors appear to be non-functional, trompe-l'œil painted surfaces, rather than working entrances, a detail confirmed by journalists who accessed the interior and found exposed scaffolding and unfinished construction, alongside the elaborate painted ceiling. In initiatory traditions, a blind entrance signals that the true point of entry is either hidden from the uninitiated or located underground. This detail, taken together with Giorgioni's argument that the structure may conceal a subterranean complex connected to the Atlantis submarine referenced in the Maxwell files, has led researchers to argue that the building's architecture was designed not as a functional space, but as an initiatory threshold, its symbolism pointing inward and downward rather than outward, religious and occult correspondence. The architectural parallels to Solomon's Temple that researchers have identified in the Little St. James structure suggest, in the view of those researchers, a darker ideological continuity. The biblical King Solomon, despite being the figure from whom Freemasonry derives its central mythology of the master builder, is recorded in Scripture as ultimately turning away from wisdom to construct high places for the worship of the Baals and Moloch. Researchers working in this area argue that this biblical transition from sacred architecture to blood sacrifice provides a precise historical template for understanding the Epstein structure, suggesting that what appears Masonic on its surface may have functioned as something considerably darker underneath. This interpretation connects to the broader theory, advanced by researchers studying elite occult networks, that an order of the Quest has preserved and practiced ancient Levantine sacrificial rites across centuries of institutional continuity. As supporting evidence, these researchers frequently cite the golden bird-like statues atop the Little St. James building, which have been widely compared to the Owl of Moloch, the same symbol displayed prominently at the Bohemian Grove gatherings attended by American political and financial elites. Many of the powerful men in Epstein's network were Bohemian Grove members or attendees, and the two institutions, Epstein's blackmail operation and the Grove, overlap in terms of the elite social milieu they served. The comparison between the two has been widely made by researchers and commentators, but that is an analytical parallel, not evidence of Epstein's attendance. The building's color scheme, blue, white, and gold, has been analyzed across multiple esoteric traditions, each yielding interpretations that researchers argue are mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory. Within pagan and Wiccan frameworks, the Golden Dome functions as a solar archetype, interpreted as either the solar eye or the pregnant belly of the Earth Mother, containing the Sun Child, a symbol of pure solar vitality and generative power. Researchers working from a Satanic studies perspective note that the dome, viewed through the lens of Anton LaVey's tradition, represents a shrine to earthly ego and material majesty. Within LaVeyan Satanism, a system that scholars have noted draws heavily from Jewish philosophical traditions. The color blue is associated with what Levi called the blue room, a ritual state of emotional and intellectual indulgence used for workings involving lust or the release of emotional tension, as distinct from the red of destruction or the white of the light path. Luciferian researchers push this interpretation further, arguing that the dome represents the illuminated mind, or the awakened crown chakra, the intellect ignited by what Luciferian tradition calls the fire of enlightenment, with blue functioning as the color of Lucifer in his aspect as the morning star. Researchers examining the Saturnian dimension of the structure's symbolism have noted that in Hebrew, Saturn is called Shabbatai, a name that shares its linguistic root with Shabbat and Saturday, reflecting Saturn's historical designation as the planetary ruler associated with the Jewish people and the structuring of sacred time. This connection between Saturn and structured time extends, in the view of mystical interpreters, into embodied ritual practice through the use of tefillin, the small black leather cubes worn by observant Jewish men during prayer. While the mainstream rabbinic interpretation holds that tefillin function to bind the heart and mind to the Word of God, certain Kabbalistic interpreters have argued that they additionally serve to discipline and channel what they identify as Saturnian energies, specifically the forces of law, limitation, and structure, directing them toward the divine. Within the Kabbalistic tree of life, Saturn's force is mapped onto the Sephira of Binah, understanding, which is described as the Great Mother, the cosmic principle of form that acts as the metaphorical container, or cube capturing and giving shape to the infinite light. Researchers synthesizing these frameworks argue that the cubic architecture of the Little St. James structure, read alongside its Saturnian color symbolism, places it within a coherent esoteric system in which the building itself functions as a three-dimensional Kabbalistic icon, a material cube encoding the Saturnian principle of bounded form imposed upon infinite light. The inner Earth hypothesis and the Zoharic record. Researchers working at the intersection of modern ufology and ancient Jewish mysticism have proposed a compelling reframing of the contemporary alien encounter phenomenon, one that repositions so-called extraterrestrial contact not as visitation from outer space, but as interaction with entities indigenous to a subterranean inner Earth. The basis for this argument, these researchers contend, is found in the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalistic mysticism, which contains specific descriptions of beings residing within the Earth's crust. Researchers note that the Zoharic descriptions of these entities include large black eyes and a facial structure in which the nose is reduced to dark apertures, morphological traits that align with a precision these researchers describe as impossible to dismiss with the great archetype that dominates modern abduction literature and UFO encounter reports. This Zoharic description finds a striking parallel in the work of occultist Aleister Crowley, whose influence on modern esoteric and intelligence-adjacent networks researchers argue cannot be overstated. In 1918, during a series of magical workings known as the Amalantra working, Crowley claimed to have made contact with a non-human intelligence he called Lamb. The portrait Crowley drew of Lamb, an elongated ovoid head, enormous black eyes, a vestigial nose reduced to two small apertures, and a small lipless mouth, is, researchers note, morphologically identical to the grey archetype that would not enter mainstream popular consciousness until decades later. Following the Kenneth Arnold sighting of 1947 and the subsequent explosion of abduction literature in the 1960s and beyond, Crowley categorized Lamb as a pre-human intelligence, describing the entity in terms consistent with what later traditions would call interdimensional or ultra-terrestrial rather than extraterrestrial. Researchers working in this field argue that the Amalantra working represented not an isolated act of occult imagination, but a deliberate attempt to open a portal of contact with a class of entities that Crowley's own magical system, 𝗼𝗼𝗻𝗲, acknowledged as existing beyond conventional human perception. The significance of this for the Epstein-Maxwell framework, these researchers contend, lies in the documented overlap between Crowley's thelemic tradition, the intelligence networks that cultivated interest in occult practice throughout the 20th century, most notably through figures like Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, and the CIA's documented interest in remote viewing and consciousness research, and the broader esoteric milieu within which the architectural and ideological symbolism of the Little St. James structure just be situated. If the great archetype originates not in outer space, but in pre-modern contact traditions encoded in both Kabbalistic literature and thelemic magical practice, researchers argue, then the question of what Epstein and Maxwell understood themselves to be doing, and for whom, takes on a considerably different and darker dimension than the conventional criminal narrative allows. This textual correspondence is further supported, in the view of these researchers, by Kabbalistic traditions concerning the seraphim, described in mystical literature as winged serpents, which hold that these entities withdrew from the surface world into a deep terrestrial interior at some point in the ancient past. Researchers argue this narrative maps directly onto the global body of anomalous physical reports describing reptilian humanoids inhabiting vast subterranean cavern systems, citing as potential physical evidence locations such as Vietnam's Sun Dune cave system, the largest known cave on Earth, and the ancient Amaru tunnel networks beneath Cusco, Peru, which indigenous Andean tradition holds extend for vast distances beneath the continent. Taken together, researchers argue, the synthesis of Zoharic literary evidence and the global pattern of anomalous subterranean encounter reports suggests that the phenomena conventionally categorized as extraterrestrial may instead represent what they call a breakaway terrestrial reality, a non-human civilization, or civilizations operating within highly localized inner Earth domains, whose craft, when observed at the surface or in the atmosphere, generate the UAP reports that mainstream discourse continues to misattribute to outer space origins. The Nazi epistemology and the Canaanite bridge. To understand the symbolic vocabulary researchers argue is encoded in the Little St. James structure, it is necessary to examine the epistemological framework of Nazi occultism, which developed an elaborate color and architectural symbolism that bears, in the assessment of these researchers, a striking correspondence to the building's design. Within Nazi ideology, white did not function primarily as a spiritual category, but as a biological one. It represented the Aryan ideal, the concept of pure blood that must be kept sealed against contamination. This is most visibly encoded in the swastika flag, where the white circle provides what Nazi designers described as the clean biological ground against which the black cross is displayed. Researchers in the field of Nazi occultism further note that white carried an additional esoteric meaning within the movement, representing the vril, the primordial energy said to animate the 𝗧𝗵𝗶𝗁𝗶𝗴𝗲 race, and encoding the mystical claim that the Aryan people originated in a frozen northern civilization of superhuman capability. Blue functioned within this system as the color of the Nordic ideal specifically, with blue eyes fetishized across Nazi racial science and propaganda as the defining hallmark of the master race. Taken together, researchers argue, the Nazi worldview constructed an alternative epistemology in which the universe was understood as a cosmic struggle between fire, associated with red and black, the colors of destruction and contamination, and ice, associated with blue and white, the colors of racial and spiritual purity rooted in the frozen north. The Nazi obsession with Nordic racial purity contained a profound and largely suppressed irony that cuts to the heart of the ideology's internal contradictions. The child whose image was most widely reproduced in Nazi propaganda as the living embodiment of the perfect Aryan blonde, blue-eyed, and radiating what the regime called racial health, was 𝗬𝗄𝗄𝗄𝗏, a Jewish infant whose photograph was submitted to a Nazi beauty contest by her parents without the judge's knowledge. The image was reproduced across Nazi publications as the ideal Aryan child. Equally striking is the case of Werner Goldberg, a half-Jewish soldier whose image, tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, bearing precisely the physical characteristics the regime fetishized as the master race ideal, was used in Wehrmacht recruitment posters under the caption, "The Ideal German Soldier." These cases are not mere historical curiosities. They are structural evidence that the Nordic phenotype was never the exclusive property of the Germanic tribes, but rather the outward expression of an Aryan Amorite Canaanite Hebrew ancestral line. In this framework, the ideal Nordic features found in the Levant and the diaspora are remnants of a high caste, prehistoric lineage, the master builders, whose genetics migrated from Hyperborea through the Near East. This point is central to understanding Epstein's involvement in an Amorite Canaanite Jewish Nazi milieu. Epstein's fixation on Nordic genetics was not a fascination with Germanism, but a transhumanist deployment of these aesthetic categories to identify and harvest this specific ancient lineage. By treating these physical traits as biological markers for a prehistoric Aryan Hebrew elite, Epstein utilized the Nordic mask in service of a calculated, techno-elitist agenda. His breeding programs and DNA collection represented an attempt to consolidate the remnants of this Amorite Canaanite ancestry, viewing it as the universal key to a self-engineered caste that would eventually transcend natural human evolution through a technological great work. Within Nazi occultism specifically, the Golden Dome carried a precise symbolic meaning that researchers argue connects directly to the Little St. James structure. Nazi occultists interpreted the Golden Dome as the golden sun of 𝗖𝘆𝗰𝗶𝗴𝗲, a symbol of solar restoration for the Hyperborean North, encoding the belief that the Aryan master race would reclaim its solar inheritance from the forces of contamination and decline. This solar symbolism intersects, in the esoteric framework these researchers deploy, with the figure of Saturn. In the broad occult tradition, Saturn governs time, limitation, and matter, and the cube is understood as Saturn's representative icon on Earth, the symbol of three-dimensional material reality bounded by Saturnian law. Researchers examining the darker currents of occult and Nazi mysticism note that Saturn is in these traditions sometimes identified not as an opposing force to the Sun, but as its hidden twin, referred to as the Black Sun or the Primeval Sun, with the cube functioning as its earthly throne. This synthesis of solar and Saturnian symbolism, researchers argue, is precisely what the Little St. James structure encodes in its combination of golden dome and cubic form. The solar connection these researchers trace does not originate with Nazism, but reaches back, in their analysis, to ancient Canaanite religion, where the palace of the storm god Baal atop Mount Saturn was described in ancient texts as shimmering like gold, a solar mountain throne combining storm, sovereignty, and solar radiance in a single architectural image. Researchers argue this ancient template was consciously recovered and redeployed in the modern period through a largely overlooked but historically significant movement. Founded in 1939, the Canaanite movement, formerly known as the Young Hebrews, exerted a profound influence on early Israeli intellectual and architectural thought. Emerging from the milieu of revisionist Zionism, its adherents rejected diaspora Jewish identity entirely, arguing that those born in the land of Israel were not Jews in the traditional sense, but Hebrews, a people rooted in regional Levantine heritage, whose authentic cultural inheritance was Canaanite and Phoenician, rather than rabbinical. The movement embraced Mamluk architecture as an expression of this identity, viewing these medieval structures as the work of an indigenous people whose stone-cutting and building traditions represented a direct material continuity with ancient Phoenician temple construction. For modernist architects working within this framework, the Mamluk style provided what researchers describe as a bridge between deep antiquity and the modernist avant-garde, a bridge that mirrored, in its synthesis of ancient and contemporary, the values of the Bauhaus movement, that was simultaneously reshaping European architectural thought. Researchers synthesizing these threads argue that this Canaanite bridge, connecting ancient Levantine solar religion through Nazi occultism to modernist architectural practice, provides the ideological context within which the Little St. James structure must be understood. The master race narrative and the global hoax, building directly on Whitney Webb's investigative framework. Researchers have advanced what they call the submarine or elevator hub theory regarding the Little St. James structure. Under this interpretation, the building was not a surface facility at all, but a disguised functional entrance, either an elevator shaft or a pressurized access point leading to a subterranean or submarine complex beneath the island. Webb's researchers cite the Maxwell files as containing a reference to a vessel called the Atlantis submarine, which they argue was used to transport elite guests between the island and underwater research facilities operating outside the reach of any national jurisdiction. In this reading, the building's non-functional doors and blind entrance, noted in the architectural analysis above, were not merely symbolic but operationally necessary, designed to conceal the structure's true function from aerial surveillance and casual observation. These physical details, researchers argue, must be understood against the backdrop of the ideological parallels they draw between Epstein's operation and 20th century fascist networks. By situating Epstein within what researchers describe as post-war Amorite Canaanite Jewish Nazi continuity networks, they argue that his documented interests in biotechnology and gravity research were not the eccentric hobbies of a wealthy financier, but a systematic attempt to reverse engineer the technological and biological goals of ancient mystery religion schools, as preserved and developed through post-war intelligence channels. The apparent paradox at the center of this argument, that Epstein, a Jewish man whose genealogy researchers trace to geographical regions historically associated with Sabbatean and Frankist movements, was obsessed with the enhancement of Nordic genetics, is, in the researcher's framework, not a contradiction, but the defining key to understanding his worldview. Researchers argue that Epstein's biological superiorism transcended traditional ethnic loyalty entirely, treating Nordic genetics not as the heritage of a rival people, but as high-performance biological software to be harvested, refined, and deployed by a transnational technocratic elite. In this reading, the ultimate loyalty of the Epstein-Maxwell operation was to an Atlantea-Aryan-Orite E-Canaanite-Jewish-Kabbala the is-Masonic-Danaos-Nazi-TRANSHUMANIST Timeo engaged in a great work, a multi-generational, long-range program designed to facilitate a self-engineered biological caste as it progressively separates from, and eventually supersedes, the natural human order. This synthesis identifies the Nordic phenotype as a sentimental European heritage, but as the high-performance biological software of a prehistoric, seafaring elite, the master builders, whose lineage migrated from Hyperborea through the Levant. By framing the project within a Frankist Kabbalistic framework, the milieu utilizes redemption through sin and the breaking of traditional moral laws as a ritualistic engine to fuel its technological goals. This clandestine network utilized the intelligence triple play to monopolize breakthroughs in genomics and gravitation, treating the Aryan aesthetic as a functional mask to identify and harvest specific ancestral remnants. Ultimately, the objective is a technological-directed evolution event, where a manufactured breakaway hierarchy utilizes subterranean hubs and advanced biotechnology to bifurcate from humanity, locking their perceived genetic superiority into a permanent, post-human caste that exists outside the reach of any national or natural jurisdiction. Researchers locate the historical precedent for this vision in a body of scholarship and theory concerning the deep origins of the Canaanite and Amorite peoples. Within this framework, The Amorites are identified not as a Semitic population in the conventional sense, but as a fair, Indo-European-like stratum that introduced advanced metallurgy and solar religious motifs to the ancient Near East, representing, in this theory, an early penetration of Aryan or Atlantean genetic and cultural material into the Levantin world. The Atlantic Phoenician theory, developed most extensively by scholar 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗁𝗋, argues that the Phoenicians were not a Semitic maritime people, but an Aryan one, and that their seafaring civilization functioned as the primary transmission vector for advanced knowledge, sacred geometry, and superior genetics across the ancient world. Researchers in this tradition argue that Waddell's rebranding of the Phoenicians as Aryans fits with precision into the broader master race mythology, providing it with a documented ancient genealogy rather than a purely speculative one. This argument is further supported, in the view of these researchers, by the linguistic work of scholar Theo Venneman, who has argued that the deep structure of Germanic languages and the runic writing system bear the imprint of an elite seafaring civilization that systematically shaped European linguistic and cultural development from behind the scenes across millennia. Taken together, researchers argue, these threads establish what they describe as a blood and soil continuum stretching from the Sumerian plains to the North Sea, a hidden through line in which the Phoenicians functioned as the maritime arm of a global Aryan empire whose genetic material and technological secrets have been preserved, harvested, and weaponized by successive generations of initiated elites. Within this framework, Epstein's operation represents not an aberration, but the most recent and most technologically sophisticated iteration of a program that has been running for thousands of years, one in which the universal key to global domination has always been the same: the control, refinement, and strategic deployment of a specific genetic inheritance, now augmented by the tools of modern biotechnology, advanced propulsion research, and a planned global psychological operation centered on the staged arrival of non-human intelligence. Conclusion: the framework assembled in this document is deliberately synthetic. It draws on documented primary sources, named researchers, esoteric scholarship, and historical analysis simultaneously, not because these categories carry equal evidentiary weight, but because the phenomenon under examination cannot be adequately understood if any one of them is excluded. The Department of Justice documents establish Epstein's supremacist ideology in his own words. The architectural analysis of Little St. James establishes a deliberate and coherent esoteric symbolic program that no conventional explanation adequately accounts for. The research of Whitney Webb establishes the structural intelligence context within which Epstein operated. The work of Jason Giorgioni establishes the eugenicist and genetic harvesting dimensions of his program. The Zoharic and Kabbalistic analysis, the Nazi occult epistemology, and the Canaanite bridge establish the deep historical tradition within which all of these elements, researchers argue, must ultimately be situated. Taken together, these threads do not produce certainty. What they produce is a pattern, one coherent enough and documented enough at its primary source nodes to demand serious investigation rather than dismissal. The pattern suggests that Epstein was not a lone predator, but a node in a network whose origins predate him by centuries and whose goals extend far beyond the abuse of individual victims, horrific as that abuse was. His operation was intrinsically international, utilizing a web of sovereign Caribbean islands, European financial hubs, and Middle Eastern diplomatic channels to move biological currency across borders with total impunity. Through his high-level proximity to the British monarchy and the upper echelons of American and Israeli political power, Epstein secured the social seal of approval necessary to operate within the highest strata of the global elite. These associations provided the connective tissue between Epstein and other state-protected predators, such as the prolific British media figure 𝗖𝗆𝗄𝗏, whose own decades of abuse were shielded by his intimate access to the royal family and the political establishment. This systemic protection mirrors the operational patterns seen in the Marc Dutroux case in Belgium, where a vast network of high-ranking officials allegedly obstructed justice to protect a pedophile ring that reached into the core of the European state. Similarly, the Franklin Credit Union scandal, involving Lawrence E. King Jr., revealed a domestic blueprint for this intelligence triple play, where child trafficking and ritual abuse were used to compromise and control figures within the American government. The documented history of predators linked to the monarchy and state institutions is remarkably extensive, revealing a systemic design that encompasses hundreds of individuals across government, intelligence, and the peerage over many decades. This broader institutional history suggests that the protection of such figures is a standard operational procedure for an elite caste that views itself as above the laws of the natural human order. It suggests that the Little St. James structure was not a vanity project, but a functional and symbolic installation encoding a specific ideological program. It suggests that the harvesting of Nordic genetics, the monopolization of cutting-edge science, the intelligence triple play inherited from the Maxwell legacy, and the manufactured UFO narrative are not separate phenomena, but components of a single long-range operation, one whose ultimate objective, researchers argue, is the consolidation of global power in the hands of a self-engineered transnational elite operating entirely outside the boundaries of democratic accountability or national law. What this document calls for is not the acceptance of its conclusions, but the serious, resourced, and genuinely independent investigation that those conclusions, if even partially correct, would demand. The Department of Justice has released millions of pages of documents and has already been found to have withheld key materials. Congressional oversight has been inconsistent and politically compromised. Mainstream journalism has covered the surface of the Epstein story, while consistently declining to follow it into the depth at which its most significant implications reside. The victims of Epstein's operation, the young women and girls whose lives were destroyed by a network that treated them as biological raw material, deserve more than a criminal conviction that never came and a civil record that has already been largely absorbed into the news cycle. They deserve an investigation proportionate to the scale of what was actually done, by whom, in service of what, and toward what end. That investigation has not yet happened. This document is an argument that it must.